right. The core principles of applied rationality are decision theory and probability theory, and then the psychology of how humans actually make judgments. And when you combine these things, both probability theory about how we should be updating our beliefs, decision theory about how we should be making decisions to get the most of what we want, combined with the psychology of how we actually make decisions and how we actually update our beliefs, you can combine all that information and come up with some really great mind hacks for improving your happiness, improving your effectiveness in the world, improving the accuracy of your beliefs and the accuracy of your judgments. So for example, one of the most useful mind hacks and new mental habits that can be installed is the technique of considering the opposite. And there's a mountain of studies demonstrating that if you are presented with a question and you have an intuitive answer to what that question is, if you take a moment to stop and not answer the question, but consider the opposite of what you think it is, and consider why it might be the case that the world is different than you might immediately think it is, then that actually will improve your judgments over the long run. You'll be a lot more accurate about your judgments if you take a moment and try to consider all the reasons why you might be wrong about this thing. And that's a mental habit. It's a habit just like, avoiding the cupcakes when you pass by them on the counter, and it's a habit just like doing regular piano practice every day. You get better at it with time. Rationality, that word, does have somewhat a PR problem. It's very well liked in artificial intelligence and cognitive science and all these technical fields, but in the public eye, rationality again means something like SPARC. And what always happens in Star Trek? Well, Spock says, oh gosh, logically we just can't do this or something like that. And then actually what happens is that, the plucky human spirit, the irrational, emotional love conquers all or something like that. And rationality is sort of cold and stale and doesn't save the day. And so there are lots of negative connotations with rationality, but of course what Star Trek calls rationality or logic in terms of Spock is different from what cognitive scientists are talking about. And so I think that it often takes a lot of time to break through people's stereotypes about rationality and their misunderstandings of what rationality means in order to show them why it can be really valuable for their lives and why it can be really valuable for improving the condition of the human species. I mean, I can just say one of the most common cognitive biases that we all fall prey to is called the confirmation bias. And so we have these beliefs, and instead of looking into the world for evidence that both supports or contradicts our views, we will filter the evidence and only look at the evidence that supports our views. So, maybe you have a very liberal-leaning person, and instead of looking through all of the internet for both confirming and contradictory evidence, they'll only visit dailycoast.com and look for views and evidence that supports their position. Similarly, a conservative-leaning person might only visit foxnews.com and only seek out evidence or opinions that would support their previously held position. And so this is a bias that has us filter the evidence so that we don't have to go through the painful process of changing our minds. But a person who is trained in rationality wants to change their mind if the evidence is out there that they should. That's right. So we're running on limited hardware. There's only so much that our brains can do. So we don't actually want to use Bayes' theorem explicitly and write out Bayes' theorem and do all of these Bayesian updates when we encounter new evidence. Instead, we have to use a variety of heuristics and shortcuts. And our brain uses heuristics and shortcuts for the same reason. That's why we have these biases, is because our brain evolved to get by okay despite lacking a lot of computation power. But we can improve on the heuristics that our brains use by default, just from natural selection, by training in new heuristics that allow us to make better judgments than we would on our own, that don't require us to do Bayesian calculations all day. Yeah, the core article content on lesswrong.com is a series of blog posts called The Sequences. by Eliezer Yudkowsky. And they're really engaging and exciting introductions to some psychology of how our brains trick us into doing things that don't actually help us and into believing things that aren't true. But also it's a great introduction to probability theory and theory of computation and quantum physics and philosophy of science. And it's a lot of very pretty advanced and technical material, but explained in a very clear way and also in an exciting way, sometimes even with stories. So if you just go to lesswrong.com and click on the link for the sequences, that's where a lot of really great material is. Center for Applied Rationality, sometimes abbreviated CFAR, is an organization devoted to the teaching of rationality, what cognitive scientists call rationality. And it's interesting the difference between what the public thinks of as rationality and what cognitive scientists mean by rationality. So the public might think of somebody like SPARC, who is always very logical and gives an unnecessary number of digits, significant digits when he presents numbers like, oh yes, we're 3.768942 miles from the center of the system or whatever. But that's not what rationality is. Rationality is very different from the cognitive science perspective. From cognitive science perspective, rationality is about two different things. One is choosing actions that are actually aimed at getting what you want. So a lot of times we are irrational in the sense that we know that going on a diet and staying on a diet would help fulfill our goals, and yet we somehow don't do the thing that we know would be good for us. And so if we were more rational in terms of our actions, then we would be better at making decisions that actually fulfill our goals. The other part of rationality is sometimes called epistemic rationality, and that's about having beliefs that match the world. So we're probably all very familiar with some of the ways that we deceive ourselves. You might have heard of things like confirmation bias or hindsight bias. And these are tricks that our brains play on us for very well understood reasons. And there are particular cognitive habits that you can build into yourself with regular practice. Just like you would practice piano, you can practice getting better at thinking and getting better at avoiding self-deception. And so there's 40 years of cognitive science behind this project of improving human rationality. And we'd like to teach that to people and also give them a community within which they can practice these skills over a long period of time. Because you can't actually just have someone come into a classroom, tell them about all of these biases, and then have them go out in the world and be more rational. You have to give them a chance to install new habits and practice these skills with friends for weeks and months and years. So you also asked about what's unique about the rationality research that CFAR does, Center for Applied Rationality. And of course, many psychologists are studying heuristics and biases and also what debiasing interventions can be had, but there aren't enough of them, in our opinion. And also, the types of experiments that they're doing often are of the type where you invite people into a classroom and tell them about biases and then give them a test and see if they're better at mitigating those biases or not. But CFAR is trying to test interventions for much more long-term outcomes. So what happens when you not just teach people about biases, but give them exercises to do and have them practice it over 6 weeks and follow up with them every week and then follow up with them a year later and 2 years later. So those are the types of experiments that the Center for Applied Rationality intends to run. The rationality skills and the new thinking habits that are taught at the workshops run by the Center for Applied Rationality are also the kind of subject matter that's covered on lesswrong.com in these sequences, these blog articles. And so lesswrong.com also has a part of the site that is devoted to organizing meetups for local people in cities like Berkeley, San Francisco, Melbourne, New York City, Los Angeles, etc. People who want to meet up because they care about improving their rationality and they care about socializing with other people who care about improving their rationality. And really, because we are social creatures, we can't just read articles on the internet and then change how we act in the world. Most of us can't do that very well. Most of us will do a lot better if we are socializing with other people, other primates, and we're bonding with them, and we're learning these things together and enjoying each other. At the Singularity Institute, we think training in rationality is actually very, very important for thinking clearly about the likely effects of emerging technologies. Because what our brains want to do by default is tell stories that we saw in science fiction about what will happen in the future, or just use our gut instincts to predict what will happen, instead of using Monte Carlo simulations and probability theory and agent-based models and so on to predict what will happen in the future. And so there's also this well-known cognitive bias or cognitive heuristic called the absurdity heuristic. There's this well-known cognitive bias called the absurdity heuristic that people will use to judge how probable something is based on how crazy it sounds to them. But if you would have asked somebody 100 years ago if they think that there could be this device that fits in their pocket and they can talk to somebody on the other side of the world and look up information on any subject in the world and play games with somebody on the other side of the world, they would say, that's absurd, that's impossible, that will never happen. But of course, we just call them iPhones and everybody has them. So how absurd something sounds to us now is not actually a good measure of how likely it is. To figure out how likely something is, we have to use probability theory. Right, so Center for Applied Rationality does run semi-regular workshops or retreats where 15 to 30 people come together and go through a bunch of exercises and classes and learn these skills and practice them with each other. And then there's also usually follow-up so that the people can get some help in implementing these new habits in their lives after they go back home to wherever they live, where they don't have necessarily the privilege of being surrounded every day by 15 other people who are trying to do the same thing. So I think that kind of intensive training when you're surrounded by other primates doing the same thing is pretty important for humans when we're trying to install new habits. Right, so the Center for Applied Rationality does many camps and workshops for different types of people. We've run several workshops for people who are familiar with the content on lesswrong.com already. CFAR has run one workshop for entrepreneurs targeted at the kinds of problems that entrepreneurs want to solve. And SPARC was a camp targeted at people with very high mathematical ability, so people who tested very well on the USA Math Olympiad or other comparable tests like the Siemens Math Research contest and so on. And so this was an opportunity for us to teach people the sort of hardcore mathematics behind the science and math of rationality. And so it delved a lot deeper into induction and probability theory and Markov models and some of the more technical math that lies behind the science of rationality. The Center for Applied Rationality has definitely considered putting online courses, making online courses available about rationality, and they've explored a couple of opportunities for doing that. Right now they're focusing on a couple of other things, but if they are able to raise enough funding, that probably is something that they would like to do in the near to medium term future. There aren't any results from the research that CFAR has been doing so far, but for example, for a camp that we held in June, we did a randomized controlled trial and have been tracking life success outcomes, and we'll do that over a period of maybe a year or more. And so that will be able to measure whether or not the camp had positive impacts or negative impacts on people. What difference does this kind of rationality training actually make in people's lives over the long term? That's something we'd like to know. We'd like to know if the product that we're selling, if the services we're selling actually improve people's lives, or if they just get them excited for a little while. If it is only getting people excited for a little while, then we need to change something about what we're doing so that we are making a long-term impact on people's lives like we want to be. Rationality isn't just about individuals making better decisions and having more accurate beliefs, but also about helping groups to make better decisions and have more accurate beliefs. And so there are some unique problems that you have to solve when you're working in a group. One of them is, for example, how much should I change my belief when you tell me your opinion about something? What kind of evidence is your opinion about something to me? And so there are a number of things that you can do to figure out how much you should change your opinion based on the testimony of somebody else. You can ask questions like, well, how much expertise is this person likely to have? Is this person likely to have been exposed to a biased sample of the data or not? And these are questions that you can ask that can improve your ability to make appropriate adjustments to your own beliefs in response to testimony from others when you're working in a group. Well, there are lots of problems that usually come up when groups are trying to work together. People's egos get in the way, people get defensive, people don't like their ideas being disagreed with. And so, for example, one of the classes that is taught at Center for Applied Rationality workshops often is one on combat reflexes and noticing when you are feeling like you're going into a discussion like it's a battle or a war where you're trying to win, as opposed to going into a conversation and being curious to figure out what's true, and not going into a conversation like you already know what's true, but like you're on a treasure hunt trying to figure out where the treasure is and you don't know where it's buried. This is exactly the kind of community that we want to promote with the Center for Applied Rationality and with lesswrong.com. We want to promote a community in which people are rewarded when they change their minds in response to evidence. We want people to be rewarded when they admit that they were wrong about something. We don't want to reward people just for sticking to their guns and being consistent and not changing their mind. You can get a flavor for what conversations are often like when you listen to politicians insulting each other or complaining about how the candidate flip-flops or changes their mind. But in fact, changing your mind is exactly what you should do if you've been presented with good evidence to change your mind. And so we want a community of people that is rewarding people for good epistemic and instrumental practice, good rationality practice, as opposed to rewarding people for being, obstinate and not changing their minds and just being very confident in their original position forever, like is the case in many domains. As far as I know, there is one rationality app that the Center for Applied Rationality has put out already. You can find it in the Android market and the iPhone App Store. I think it's called the Calibration Game, and I have already been playing it for half an hour today on my phone. It's this game where it presents you with a bunch of questions and you give what you think is the right answer and also how confident you are in that judgment. And you just do that again and again and again, and then you learn how often you're right. Right, well, there are a number of ways in which rationality training or improved reasoning strategies could improve the human condition. For one thing, there's a paper out called Giving Debiasing Way in Psychological Science and the Public Interest, and that has to do with the fact that a lot of violent radicalism has its roots in people's inability to change their minds, inability to update on evidence, inability to consider alternative hypotheses about how the world works. And so a lot of radicalism and extremism that causes violence comes from a lack of rationality training. And so better rationality training around the world might reduce various forms of extremism. Another one is that rationality training can improve and accelerate scientific progress, because a lot of times, there's this famous quote that scientific progress moves when the older generation dies and the younger generation takes over, because even scientists can't just change their mind when they see new evidence a lot of the time. But if people were more able to just change their mind whenever they got better evidence of another theory, maybe you could be a person who changes your mind once a week or twice a week even. That might really accelerate scientific progress and provide, new medical discoveries that save lives. Most people give to charity based on whether they come across the charity and they feel good about it, or maybe they're guilt tripped into giving. But what would a person who's concerned with rationality do? Well, they would say, which charity is going to do the most good for every dollar that I give them? So a person who's trained in rationality and wants to give to charity will say, not, oh, well, why don't I just give to this charity because they happen to approach me in the mall? Instead, they would say, okay, I care about, reducing human suffering. What's the most efficient way for me to purchase the reduction of human suffering with my dollars? And it turns out that different charities make very different impacts per dollar on the reduction of human suffering. If you give to this one charity versus another, you can sometimes make 10,000 times more difference in the reduction of human suffering, or what's called quality adjusted life years, if you give to one charity rather than another. And so if you just do basic simple arithmetic and multiplication, you can come up with some really startling changes in your behavior with regard to charity. Similarly, when it comes to scientific funding, a lot of science is driven by where you can get the grants and what will get you the most prestige, what will get you tenure. But you could do science in a different way where you think about, okay, what do I want to accomplish in the world? Well, and what is currently being understudied? Well, almost nobody is paying attention to the science of how to avoid global catastrophe this century with all these powerful new technologies we're creating. Maybe that's the thing that I'll do, since almost nobody's working on that. Lots and lots of people are working on cancer research. It's very important. Lots of people are working on global warming. It's very important. But risks from artificial intelligence or synthetic biology are also very important, and very few people are working on them. Yeah, Giving What We Can and GiveWell are two organizations that do the analysis for you of figuring out which charities purchase the most good per dollar, at least in specific domains like poverty reduction and global health.